Hello, welcome to the video lecture, however you want to call it, about the first part, the first phase, and then the first step within what it means to create a strategic plan for a campaign or a program, right? So we are talking about the strategic part of PR, and then we'll talk about things that go into each of the phases, each of the steps. And so this is very much following the textbook, which is really a good textbook and a good blueprint for this. And my only change, I guess I would say, to the new textbook. So the initial author of the textbook died sadly 2 years ago or something like this. And so you will see that his name is the second on the textbook. They kept his name, of course, because for all the editions in the textbook, he's the one that came up with it and wrote it and all that. And then the new one that took it over, because it's such a good, important textbook, is the first author that appears on your current version of the textbook, right? And so she, for some reason, made some changes. Some of them I think they're great because it updated content that needed to be updated for the current situation. But she did make a weird change within the steps that you see here. And she added part of the formative research, a step that has to do with planning research. The whole formative research phase is about research, so I don't see how that's just a one tiny step and it comes after number one or number two. So that's a bit weird within the process and the way this goes in practice. So I'm just keeping the original version of there are 9 steps and here's how this goes. So just FYI, this is why I'm using this one from the previous edition. Other than that, like the new edition it's better in the sense that it updated examples, it talks about more the digital things that are happening now that weren't happening in the former edition and so on and so on. But I just wanted you to know really research itself and making sure you do the right research across board. It's part of this whole phase. And then you'll see it's part of the end as well. So that's why within this formative research part, the 3 steps that I agree with the original version are analyzing the situation, analyzing the organization, and analyzing the publics. And we'll see why and how you do all this. So the whole point in a PR campaign or PR plan, strategic PR plan, right? Because it has to be strategic, is that in order for you to figure out anything, right? After, let's say, your boss or your client comes to you and says, oh, I think this is what's going on, or I want this type of campaign. But the first thing after that is not for you to go tactical, is not for you to go problem solving yet, in a sense, it's not for you to come up with like, oh, we're going to do these 3 cool events, because you actually don't know anything yet, right? So then the first part or the first 3 steps, the first thing that you have to do is do your research, do legit research. So then when you do strategize and you come up with the elements of your plan that are going to be needed, right, to implement everything, you do so based on reality, based on facts, based on data, based on actually understanding who the organization is that you're doing this for, because it's important, right? Remember, as a PR person, you're really the bridge between organization and publics. So who you're doing this for, you need to understand the organization. You need to understand what's happening, the situation. Is this a bad thing? Is this a good thing? Is it going to be a crisis? Is it going to be an opportunity? Is it a bit of both? Like, what's the situation? And then you need to understand the publics that exist. And we are going to talk more in that video about what publics actually means, and publics versus audiences and target publics and so on. But you need to understand these main 3 big things, if you want, big concepts: the situation, the organization, and the publics, right? So how do you do this? Through a lot of research. And this research can be initially in an initial phase. Usually it's more like secondary research, like you're seeing what the client says, you have a Q&A with the client, you see what other research, or maybe if they have data, a lot of organizations may have already some data, maybe not all data. So you see what's existing already. That's called secondary research. It's research based on things that you're not doing yourself yet, but you're looking at other reports. It could be reports from other studies. It could be reports from like the industry, like Pew Research, and so on. That's secondary. And then, of course, you also have to do a lot of primary research. So that's when you actually, you and your team or your organization, you actually go and do surveys, you do interviews, you do focus groups, you do content analysis of, let's say, social media channels, and so on and so on, right? So you actually do a lot of research as well. And then in terms of research itself, this can be qualitative. So those are things where you care more about the how and the behind the scenes and in-depth rich data. So you're not interested in the numbers, you're not interested in statistics, you're interested in understanding how people think or how they define certain things or their attitudes and why that happens. Why do they say that? And so those are things like when you do interviews or focus groups, or qualitative content analysis, you're interested in those like rich data. You're not trying to see how many people think this, right? Like there's not. If you are interested in how many people think this or relationship between variables, right, where we need stats, then it's quantitative. So those are things like surveys and experiments and quantitative content analysis. Oftentimes what we do within this setting for a PR campaign, especially if it's a legit bigger PR campaign, you're going to end up with a mixed methods approach. So for example, when you end up in a PR campaigns class and you have real clients and everything else, you will eventually realize that for you to be successful in planning your campaign for the client, you really need to do a mix of both. So majority of the teams will do something like interviews and or focus groups, plus surveys, plus maybe content analysis or social media analysis, again, depending on what's going on, or media analysis sometimes if the client felt like the media is, that they're portrayed in a certain way in the media, right? So you do as much research as you need to figure these things out, right? The situation, the organization, and the publics. And of course, then you don't do the research just to do the research, but you do all this research, you analyze the data, and you have findings, right? Like here's what the data is showing. And then out of all these findings, all this data, the most important thing that helps you out is your insights. The so what, translating those findings into, okay, what do these findings mean for me and for my PR campaign? So based on this, then essentially how this goes is you go into the planning of your campaign. So all this research that you have done on these three things and the insights that provides to you that you draw from all those findings help you then decide, okay, this is what's going on. This is, the client came to me and they thought this is the issue, but I did all this research and it turns out the issue is not so bad, or maybe the issue is worse, or it's an opportunity, or both, whatever, right? And so you figure out, okay, this is what the focus needs to be of the PR campaign. And then all those insights and the data helps you figure out who the target public or publics need to be. Then it helps you segment each of those big groups. And we'll talk about publics versus audiences and how you do that. But the research, the data and the insights is what helps you then based on those to make that segmentation into actual target audiences per each public. And then have like super personalized tactics and goals and objectives and strategies and messaging and everything else, which is what you need and what makes a campaign winning or really bad in terms of like how, once you implement it, how successful it's going to be. Also based on that research, you set up everything else, right? So goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, and then the implementation part, right? So the other thing that you notice here in my attempt to be very visual and explain to you how everything connects together and why we need all these different things, and they need to come in a certain order and be done in a certain way, is because then everything builds on each other, right? So what you see here, goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, all of these are per target audience. So they need to be connected to the target audience. Of course, the goals and objectives and everything else also need to be illustrative of what the organization is and who they are and what they do and everything else, right? It has to be all tied together. The same for strategies, the same for tactics. And then the actual implementation would be, right, like I'm doing all these things, putting them into practice in the actual campaign once the plan has been approved and everything else. And then in the evaluation part, which is again, research, because you want to see, did you achieve your objectives or not? And of course, every part of this has its own specifics, and the videos and the lectures and the textbook explain all of them. And we're going to go over through all of these things. But it's very important for you to understand that it's done in this certain order, and that it's important to understand the importance of research and to actually do it and have all these elements be tied together in the right way, and all these elements be actually based on reality, on data, on what your research actually shows. Otherwise, anyone could do a PR campaign, and if it worked that way without having to be very realistic, just creative, everyone essentially, I guess, would be able to be a PR strategist or a PR person, and I guess make tons of money out of nothing. But reality is what matters and data is what matters. So what happens with, and we have so many examples, with campaigns that are not based in reality, they didn't understand their audiences, they didn't understand their publics, they didn't do the research or maybe enough research. And then they come up with these whole elements of the campaign, and they may be super creative, or they may be things that worked for other people, other organizations, right? Similar to those. And then they end up finding out that it's not working out and they're not achieving their objectives, and the whole thing ends up being a flop, or worse, it causes a crisis. That's what happens when you don't actually do that research, right? Now, for the purpose of this class, most of you wouldn't have taken the research class. If some of you may have, but most of you wouldn't have. It's a class that usually you take after this one. Number one. And number two, it's not a PR campaigns class, which you do everything in one, and that's the purpose of that capstone. It's one of the last classes you take, right? Where you apply everything you learned already. So for that purpose, and still wanting to get you to go through this process so you're better prepared for the PR campaign class, but also so you're better prepared for the actual practice of what we do in PR campaigns and PR plans. For your projects, you get the research, quote unquote, from me, and you get the scenario and everything else, right? So you're going to get a lot of information from me, and you're going to pretend that you did that research and those are the results. And then based on that, you do the rest of the plan. So all of that is going to come, it's going to be a separate video and separate instructions and so on. And of course, meet with me, email me at any point about lectures, about textbook, about these projects. Of course, any questions, if you need help. And the biggest advice I have for that as well is don't wait till the last second, because it's harder to help you when it's close to a deadline, or then if the deadline has passed, it's even harder to help you, if at all, by default of how things go. So we are now in this video in this formative research phase, and we're talking about analyzing the situation. So formative research, again, as we talked about, is the research you do at the beginning to understand everything. So you can then, based on actual data and real facts, be able to plan your actual PR campaign. So it's really using and like researching and using data and findings and turning those into insights about the situation, right? So what your client or your boss comes for you for, the publics and the organization. And based on all that, you build the communication strategic plan or campaign. The strategic research, and your textbook also talks about that, is any type of research that you're doing for a strategic purpose when you're gathering information about issues and publics and anything else. And then we also do in PR generally, just so you know, we do tactical research. So like even for like small tasks, right? Like you're just the one person that's writing a news release. You don't just wake up with the news release. You have to do some research for that. But for the purpose of a big campaign, which is what this class is talking about when we talk about strategic PR and PR strategies and the whole process, so you understand how that goes and are able to go through each element, this is what we do formative research. And then within your day-to-day PR and within a campaign, of course, you're going to also do these two types of research as well. Formative research, we talked about that. It can be primary or secondary. Usually we start with secondary. It can also be more formalized research, right? So like when I do an actual interviews, or I do actual surveys, or I do like the legit formal research, but it can also be informal. So like, let's say your client came to you with this, and like informally you're having another meeting with the client, or you're going around maybe some people that you know that are in the same industry. So it's not yet a legit, it's not like it's legit research, but it's informal. So it's not yet systemized. So it wouldn't be the only research you do, but you could start there. And then it can be quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. And again, usually you end up with the mixed methods. The initial research, so in real terms, how this happens, if you're a PR agency, You'll have a client that comes and says, here's what I think it's happening, or here's what I think the situation is, and here's what I would like the campaign to focus on, or I want the campaign about ABC, right? Or if you're internal PR doing this for your own organization, essentially it's your boss or your team who are kind of coming and doing this and saying this. Again, to be able to do anything after that, you need to do this initial research. So usually we start in what's called the situation analysis assignment, or the situation analysis assessment, or whatever you want to call it, but like it's called the situation analysis, and it's an initial research in which you're looking especially initially at secondary data, secondary research. So you're looking at what's already existing, because you also don't know what you don't know to be able to do primary research yet. So you're going to look at the situation. Okay, you have, here's what your client is saying. Then you're going to look it up. Let's say your client is worried that people just hate their organization, and that's why they are not using their services. And you're like, okay, I need to investigate this further. So you're going to take a look at media reports of that organization. You're going to take a look at maybe social media, like what people are saying in reviews about that organization. But it's not yet primary research. So you're not doing a full-on interviews. You're not doing surveys with customers. You're not doing like any of that yet. It's like the initial type of research. So you're getting an idea of like what seems to be the situation. So based on that initial thing, you can be like, okay, the client is kind of right. Or from what I'm seeing initially, it seems that they may not have necessarily a attitude problem, like that people hate them, but it seems kind of like that they may not know about them, or like we don't see much about, like no media articles about this, we don't see many posts, or we don't see reviewers. It's almost like people just don't know they exist, right? Which is a different situation than what the client thought. You do your research about the organization, the same, you go on their website, you look at how they're organized, you look at the role of PR, like all these things that are important, again, in this secondary type of research with existing data. Then you look at existing publics, right? So like you start making a map of, okay, which are the big groups that are not target publics yet, but these are like groups that exist around the organization. And again, we're going to talk more about what each of these things mean. So this is what like the situation analysis initial research looks like. Then you, based on this, then you can be like, okay, here's what I know so far. This all about situation, organization, existing publics, right? I looked at trends, everything. And then you're like, but I still don't know a lot of things, right? But now you're going to have a better image of, now I need to do primary research. So I now know, because I did the initial research, that I need more information on this type of groups that could be potential target publics. I need more information from these things, so I could then choose to do, let's say, a survey with those groups that you think may end up being target publics, interviews, focus groups. You may also choose to include some research, the primary research that you do within the organization, again, depending what it is about. You will do a formal and actual primary research on the social media, for example, like a social media audit, like a legit one, and so on and so on. So now, though, you know exactly what you need from your actual primary research. So you're going to be able to plan that research and be like, here are my research questions. I need to find out what these groups are thinking. I need to find out how things are going internally, for example, and I need to find out what the narratives are, or what the attitudes are on social media, right? I'm making this up because it's going to depend on the specifics. So then once you figure that out, you can do that research. And again, the idea for the primary research, for adding that, and why you don't stop just at the initial research, is because, again, you need to find out the real deal about the actual situation. Is this a problem? Is it an opportunity? Is it that people hate this organization or what they stand for? Or is it simply they have no idea they exist? So how can they like or hate products or services they don't even know that they exist, right? It's an opportunity versus a problem, or it could be both. Then you need to truly understand who do you need to target, because again, you'll see in the public's video that there are many such groups all the time. At any point for an organization, there are very various groups of people that are publics, but you're not going to target them all ever. Even in big campaigns, you can't target everyone, and you'll see why, right? So then you need to figure out, okay, what do I need to find out so I can then specifically understand who am I targeting and how to segment those into audience. goals, objectives, everything else, right? Including message strategy. So again, the next videos will show you more of what goes into everything. And again, for the purpose of this class, you're not going to do your own research because it would be a lot too much for a class like this, and most of you wouldn't have taken a research class anyway. So we are now talking about step one in the phase one, analyzing the situation. What's a situation? It's a set of circumstances facing an organization. It's what's going on type thing, right? In the plan, for us to understand how we are even going to plan a campaign and figure everything else out, we need a clear statement. We need to understand very specifically what the situation is. And again, like in the previous example, is this a good thing, a bad thing? Is it a mix of both? Like what's going on for us to then be able to plan a campaign for that purpose? A situation, like we said, can be an opportunity. So let's say they have a new service, an organization, or a new feature, or let's say they have a lack of awareness around them, like people don't know they exist, but that's an opportunity because if people don't know they exist, it means that they have no negative preconceptions. They simply don't know they exist. It's more of an opportunity than if people knew that they existed, so they had high awareness, but negative attitudes towards them because let's say they tried their products and they were awful or something, right? So it can be an opportunity, it can be a problem or an obstacle, like negative attitudes or like a boycott, or like even we are full on crisis. That's a whole different type of campaign and a whole different type of class. So take a crisis class, please, because you never know when you're going to be in that situation as a PR person or having to deal with those, right? And sometimes it can be a mix of a little bit of both opportunity and or problem. But the point is always, how can we get to the opportunity level? And if we are seeing a problem or an obstacle pending that is not a full-on crisis, and even then, can we turn that around, right? And then your campaign focuses on that versus your campaign focusing on just increasing awareness of people or whatever else. But I need to understand what's going on. And so I need to analyze the situation and do a lot of research to find that out. When you write plans, and again, there are exceptions to this rule. So when you go into the job forest, see how your company or your PR agency or whatever you end up does it. As a general rule, some of these plans, when they write in the strategic plan, the situation, usually initially before the explanation is written as a noun. So you'll see things like loyalty of fans, or nurturing fan loyalty, or whatever, like a low awareness of fans or something like that. And then when you explain the organizational goals, then like it gets more action oriented. So it's more like a verb, right? Like nurturing fan loyalty, increasing awareness of publics, or whatever it is, right? Again, it's something, and your textbook also talks about this. But then it's also, there are exceptions to this. Like I've seen places where they don't do it like this. So when you are in an actual organization, company, when you work in a PR agency, obviously see how they do these things. The most important thing for these classes in PR that you take is you understand the process, you understand the rules. There are certain things that are always that way. And then also just understand that other things depend, right? A lot of the things we talk about in PR, it depends. For example, I cannot give you formulas for, or to be able to say like every single campaign, you're going to have these target audiences or this target public, because it's so dependent on the situation, the organization, what's going on and everything else, right? So this is one of those things I think is good for you to know, and try to learn it this way first, and then see wherever you end up when you actually do get jobs in the industry and see how they do it. They may do it differently. So for this first part, I mean, you're gathering information when you do it informally, or like in the initial situation analysis, from a lot of sources and through a lot of ways. So you're looking at what type of situation it is, you're looking at the background, you're looking at doing things like SWOT analysis, PESTEL, this thing, 100 facts, you're trying to collect the 100 facts from external sources, right? Again, it's secondary type research. About what's going on, about the situation. And they're all great tools. You just have to figure out what works for you. And we're going to talk more about SWOT and PESTEL. So then what's important to understand as you're digging into the situation is what's the stated issue, aka what the client came and told you, or your boss if it's your own organization. right? What they think is going on, what the client thinks is going on, versus what's called the actual issue, which is after this primary research, this initial research, and then after the more research that you've done, actual primary research, was the actual issue, right? Through all this research at the end of it, before you're actually planning the final strategic plan, was the actual issue we are trying to solve. And sometimes they'll be the same. So sometimes you'll write in your plan, the client came or the stated issue, let's say, negative attitudes towards the organization. The client came and they think this is what's going on. And then you'll have the part about actual issue, and you'll say, based on the initial research and then further based on primary research, the actual issue is that there is low awareness of the organization. And then you can then go explain how this is actually an opportunity, for example. Or sometimes it may be flipped. The client may think it's not a big deal, and you discover it's like, oh, we're almost in a crisis. But it's very important to not just rely on that initial assessment of the client or the boss or whoever, and actually do all this research. This is why we do all this research. This is why we do initial research on the analysis on the situation, and then we dig even deeper through primary research. So very important to remember stated issue versus actual issue. Make sure across board in the situation analysis part and all the parts of your plan, I would say once you get it to the final version, that every time anything is written is very clear what are actual facts and things based on data, and then very clearly where the data comes from, aka is it from your own research, is it a Pew Research report, right? Like citing and attributing sources is very important. And making a clear distinction was based on facts and data and where that comes from, citing it, versus assumptions. It's okay to have some assumptions in our plans, but it needs to be very clear where those come from. And it needs to be very clear that those are your own assumptions, right? And ideally your plans, a good plan is not just going to be based on assumptions, because then you didn't probably do any research. And then the plan is again, not based on just data, or like majority of data is just based on assumptions, which may or may not be correct. So that's very important also to know. And then in real life, what happens is you do an initial situation analysis, where you have this like secondary research that you have conducted. You usually go back and forth with your client or your boss. The key players need to always be informed because you need their buy-ins, right? So you want to make sure you're on the right track. So especially if you find something else than what they thought was going on. So there is some back and forth between us and the client in like, here's what we found. And then of course, after the primary research, the same way. Now, things are different and that's a different discussion. I'm happy to talk more about that. Like if you want to Zoom or whatever else, or meet, there are different ways that this works in different situations, right? Like, do you already have the client? Are you doing their campaign, or are you pitching the client a version, like an idea of the campaign, and then you're competing with a bunch of other people, and then you're actually gonna do or like improve the plan? So there are different ways that this works, right? But we always want to make sure that the key players are on the same page, and there is no weird surprises. So the last thing that you want to do, even in pitching situations or like you're competing with other agencies, is like to surprise the client at the very end with no context, because they wouldn't have gone through the process that you've gone through. And so even when you write your plan out and when you do the presentation, remember that the client wasn't there with you through this process of discovery, that you learned all these things now that you know. The client probably doesn't know half of that, and majority of the times they don't come from PR anyway. So it's very important in the pitch and in written plan that you do that everything is very well explained, and you don't forget or you don't assume that the client just is on the same page with you or will have the buy-in for you. So it's always very important to understand who the client is, who the organization is, their resources, right? And we'll talk more about that in the organization part. Because I say, if it's a nonprofit and they don't have a lot of resources, your plan should never include things that they need to do where they need a lot of resources, because realistically it's not going to happen. So we want to make sure that things coincide. And again, remember, as a PR, by the PR definition, we are the bridge between the organization and the publics, and we want there to be win-win situations, right? Mutually beneficial relationships. So this is one of the examples of like, how do we go from problems to opportunities? This was an external problem though. So the Dove campaign, and again, they are not a perfect company. Of course, they have other examples where we can look at their crises. But this is not, we are talking about the campaign that was actually very successful in this case. I just wanted you to know that each of these companies has good things and bad things that happen. So it doesn't mean that Dove is always awesome and they had no crisis, or Unilever. So in this case, this was like 2004 or 3, I can't remember the year exactly, but essentially they had done research. So this wasn't necessarily about them, but they found that women, and especially younger women, and then they did some other research and they found especially in girls, so like in those formative years, that women tend to like see just problems, right? Like, oh, I'm not this enough, I'm not skinny enough, I have curly hair, I don't have long hair, I have short hair, whatever it is, right? Like we tend to just kind of like be hard on ourselves. And in parallel, they found that at that time, in all the marketing of like all these products, including their own, right? So they were also guilty of that, is that traditional marketing relied on these idealized portrayals, right? And so like the perfect women, the perfect shape, the perfect this, the perfect skin color, like they had like models, right? And so they didn't feature real women, so to speak, like daily normal person on the street, or diverse publics that kind of like show the diversity of their publics, right? In terms of age, sex, everything. So then they realize also that this type of marketing and like over and over again leads to this situation where, you know, older women feel like they're not beautiful anymore because they're older, or like they're white hair, like, oh, I should always dye my hair, like things like that. And so they decided to be the change of the industry and saw the opportunity of like redefining the situation. And all this, especially the research, essentially gave them the idea for this new approach and the campaign called Campaign for Real Beauty, right? And so I included here some links, including the agencies that did a lot of this work for them. So please read them. I'm not gonna make this a video that's longer than it needs to be to just play it on the video. So make sure you go to the PowerPoint, click on these, read them, and then this is, I think, one of the clips. It was a real success. They got the media talking. It created some controversy, right? Because like no one was talking about this before. There was no real talk about, oh, look, the marketing has a role to play in this and it's not looking good. And we are creating these negative trends on women, and it's starting to be earlier and earlier, like little girls, or formative years, that like they don't like anything about themselves and so on. And the standards are not real standards of beauty, right? So they got talked about everywhere in the media and everything else. It was a huge campaign. And then they continued that. They created a fund as well. They continued that. They had like 3 or 4 other campaigns, equally successful. And so in this case, though, they created an opportunity, obviously, for them. At the end of the day, remember, they're still a business, right? So they still also want to sell more products. But, and somewhat, this wasn't something bad 100% that just them were doing, but they were like, we're going to be the leader in changing this. And the other thing that they did, to their credit, other than just this being a communication campaign and like pinpointing the problem and solutions, is that they did change their practices as well for that, right? So they started actually employing in their ads, in their marketing, in their communication strategies and tactics, real women. And you still see this today. Now, again, does this mean that they never like had any problems or any crisis? No. So you can look up Dove and crisis or Unilever and crisis, you'll find a bunch of things. But for that time, this campaign was very, very like amazing. And the way they use research and the way that they turn those into actual opportunities for this purpose. Another way for, or like another example for a brand on how they went from a problem, but their problem, which also was kind of starting to being a crisis, into an actual opportunity, is the KFC. And again, this is an interview with them and their agency and how they did that. And then this is like one of the, I guess, the ads that played and why it played. So please watch it. This one is really, it's a newer thing, and it was really funny also. It's an example of an international PR. So those of you who are going to take international, this should be one of those things that you look at. So I would also like to hear from you if you watched these two videos, and tell me if this would have worked if it happened in the US, and if they tried to pull that, what they did in UK, if they tried to do that in the US, would it have worked the same way? What do you think? Why yes, why not, or maybe? Okay, so now this is an example that's closer. It's a made up example, but this is kind of like an example that's closer to how it's gonna look in your plans. So let's say the organization is the UMC Hospital Lubbock. Again, I made this up, so it's not, they didn't actually go through this or want to do this. It's a made up example that's very close to reality and how it would look. So let's say the organization is UMC Hospital Lubbock. Let's say that their business goal is, or business aim is, to attract more people into their new wellness center that is conceptualized and works to be more than a gym. For example, they have like real doctors, they have dietitians, they have a physical therapy. So it's not just a gym, it's a whole holistic thing where you have all these experts and of course gym-like things, but much more. Their stated issue, so they came to you as a PR agency and said, we think that there are negative pre-existing attitudes towards gyms and or hospitals, and probably even us as UMC or our gym, our wellness center, and we want you to fix it. That's the stated issue. Now, let's say you did secondary research initially, and you are discovering as of now that it seems that the actual issue is the lack of awareness and proper communication. See how it's phrased? Very much like the thing we talked about earlier in this lecture. So then you could write this something like, explain it further, saying something like this: the actual issue might be low awareness and a lack of communication. While national and local trends show opportunities for wellness sectors, it seems potential customers might not know at all or enough about this center, and the social and media communication are inconsistent. Again, here you would cite where you got things. So for example, if you looked briefly at social media, their social media, you would say that. The trends, you would cite Pew Research, or if it's local sources, you would cite where they come from. It's just hard for me to fit it all in one slide, so just remember to do that in the plan. Then based on primary research, in the final situation analysis and plan document, you could say something like lack of awareness, negative perceptions, loyalty of current members, whatever it is that's applicable there, and then explain that in the final version where you would have had the actual primary research. Again, all this stuff is going to be given to you. You have to connect the dots, but you're not doing secondary or primary research for this class because it would be too much. So they need to look something like this. While national and local trends show growth for wellness sectors, our research shows A, B, C, D, and then you explain that. Yeah, from your textbook as well. And these are good like questions to help you as you're planning things and as you're going through the process. For analyzing the situation, was the situation facing the organization? Was the background of the situation? Was the significance or importance of the situation? Was the stated versus actual issue? All important things to keep in mind as you're going through this process. So, any questions so far about any of these? Please let me know. Email me, you know how to find me. I want to make sure that everything is clear, and make sure you're watching all this. Make sure you click on the examples, make sure you read the things in the textbook. As again, the textbook is really important, and it is a blueprint. We still use it after graduation. I